constant equal spin. The propaganda's a win, stress feeding on my tension. My countrymen, they love their fiction. Words are now, it's made with good intentions.
Welcome to 1 of 200, the Independent Politics and Media podcast. We've got a midweek episode for you. I'm joined by my co-host, Josephine. How are you doing?
Kia ora, I'm good. How are you?
I am alive and kicking a little bit, but not too much.
Yeah, it is tough days, eh? The news that comes from Rafah keeps, startling us. It is tough times, and we do have, news from other people, indigenous people struggling against imperialism, which is what we're going to talk about today, isn't it, Kyle?
We are indeed, and we're really pleased to also be joined by Joe Xulue. Welcome to the podcast.
Boset Lofalava, thank you for having me on the podcast. I really appreciate any opportunity to discuss and share knowledge, particularly about the struggle of Kanaky people. By way of introduction, my name is Joe Xulue. Through my father, I'm an indigenous Kanaky from Hunete, which is a village on the island of Lifu. It's one of the outer islands in Kanaky. And through my mother, I'm Samoan from Lufi, and that's on Upolu. I was born in Numea, the capital of Kanaky, and where a lot of the protesting is currently happening. I was born not too far from where some of the blockades have actually been placed. And my family, when I turned around 6 years old, we moved to Aotearoa, and I've been living in Tamaki, Makaurau ever since. I only lived overseas outside of Kanaky and Tamaki when I went overseas to do my masters, and both my wife and I were able to live in Boston for a year. But otherwise, I'm ashamed to say it sometime a real true blue Aucklander, and I'm living my life as a form of penance for that every day.
You and me both. Yeah, kia ora, Joe. Thank you for joining us this evening. I guess I'll just begin by doing a little update for people who haven't been following this in the news, because while there has been reportage, it's something we've bemoaned numerous times, the reporting in the Pacific in general and Aotearoa has gone downhill in the last decade, and we're seeing less and less. So the current crisis began on May 14, when France's National Assembly passed a bill removing electoral restrictions protecting the demographic status of the nation's indigenous Kanaky people, as agreed under the Numea Accord. Now, that had basically charted a pathway to decolonization in Kanaky, and for obvious reasons, the Kanaky people have not been particularly pleased by that decision, which seems to be a rather cynical move by the National Assembly to try and change the balance of power in Kanaky. Kanaky, we're using the indigenous term, but it's New Caledonia is what you'll be seeing in Western media more often than not. So change the balance of power there to give French settlers more electoral power, thus disrupting opportunities for the independence movement to continue the path of decolonization away from French imperialism. There have been protests that have, I guess you'd say, become violent and have led to the French government sending gendarmes, I think about 3,000 armed militia to Kanaky, to quote marks, maintain order. Macron was there earlier in the week, I think over the weekend, which really shows how seriously the French national government is taking this. And he has said that those militia will be there indefinitely, which, until such a time as disorder subsides. But yeah, not really a good look. It's
actually taking the mask off French foreign policy, and it is placing us locating us within the Pacific as a sphere of European colonialism. This is an active situation. I think it's fair to say that the French government administration has lost control of the situation, which is why they have brought in all these troops to quell this indigenous independence movement led by the Kanak people. And, props to the indigenous people there. I read, in preparation for this, how long the struggle for independence has been and how the French colonial powers have manipulated, the legal systems, the constitutional structures, and so forth in order to maintain their, colonial power over Kanaky or New Caledonia. So it'd be wonderful to hear what Joe has to say about this.
Yeah, I would like that's where we are right now, and I would like to give you the opportunity, Joe, to kind of take us back in time a little in regards to the indigenous movement, because like so many of the decolonial movements and independence movements that we are seeing as flashpoints in the present day, there's a long history here behind it, despite the fact that Western politicians and Western media are trying to treat all of these as unique present day movements that not connected to each other somehow.
No, thank you both. That was a really great rundown. I couldn't have done that better myself. So thanks so much for preparing that material. I think one of the things I think has come out from what you've said is that a lot of the reporting has been rather lackadaisical. And I think what tends to be missed from a lot of this discourse and a lot of the way that we view what's happening in Kanaky is the voices of Kanak people. We get slight excerpts from press releases or comments made by certain political leaders that are easily identifiable, and that's not really reflecting the mood, so to speak. In fact, it's also quite interesting that the views of the loyalist faction in Kanaky, which tend to be a mixture of people who have recently moved over from metropolitan France, the sort of original descendants of the French Republic who came when Kanaky was set up as a penal colony. So their descendants, they're also part of the loyalist faction, and even other groups of, particularly those from neighboring French-speaking overseas territories like Tahiti and Wallis and Futuna. They also tend to be involved in the loyalist movement. So even their perspectives aren't sort of brought to light in all of this discourse. And I think I mention that because to understand where we are now is to try and understand lots and lots of different nuance and lots of layers, as you've said. For Kanak people, the struggle for what we would describe as, I guess, independence, but also indigenous sovereignty. So there are sort of two streams that sort of operate. They're like a duality. And I think that's something that's very important, because independence on one hand only refers to the use of current political structures like the Accords process in order to gain sovereignty. But it doesn't mean necessarily that the sovereignty at the end of that already established process means sovereignty for Kanak people.
Yeah, I saw some distinction being made about the notion of independence and the notion of decolonization not being the same thing. And we can see many examples, even in the Pacific, but also in Asia, Africa, Latin America, where, independence, quote unquote, was achieved, but the structures of colonialism and extraction, exploitation remain.
That's correct. Independence sometimes actually undermines the right of indigenous peoples to self-determination. And as you said, Josephine, that's experienced all over the world. Africa being the most recent example. And I've been really privileged to speak to a lot of indigenous groups from Africa, and they've explained that their countries were made independent using these sort of arbitrary geographical lines, but their people have sort of subsisted an entire culture and heritage across many different sort of bordering nations in Africa. And I think that's a much easier distinction to understand because you can think about it geographically. But for Kanak people, the difference between sort of indigenous sovereignty and independence is really lies in what's at the end of the process, or what's actually being sought. So if we follow this independence arm, we risk losing our own ability to self-determine, even if France were to say, well, look, we will remove you as part of the Republic, and we will give you this independent nationhood, but you deal to yourselves and you decide upon what that future means, or what it looks like. Whereas indigenous sovereignty means something completely different, and that's to say, as Kanak people, since we travelled to Kanaky and have felt that we are now established as one with the land, and our cultural practices and our heritage enveloped, and not only into our communities, but in the way that we react to our land and we interact with each other. That takes precedence over independence, and that will always take precedence over independence for us. We will always feel that over and above any of these political structures that have been sort of forced on us since we were annexed in 1853, that will always be secondary to how we connect and value ourselves as being one with the land and one with our culture. So for us, really, the struggle for not only independence, but also for indigenous sovereignty starts once we're annexed in 1853. And to sort of explain how the Republic has persisted its sort of form of colonialism in Kanaky, you have to think about it this way. Not until after World War II, for example, Kanaks were not allowed to be French citizens. So from 1853 to 1946, I think, it was only at that point that they decided to give us citizenship and voting rights. But at that stage, voting was only allocated to people who were of noble rank. So in our custom, we have our hierarchy that starts with paramount chiefs and chiefs of certain different districts and areas. Only people of a certain standing were allowed to participate in sort of the political economy of Kanaky. And that also included, unsurprisingly, professions that were deemed to be, I can't remember the specific words, but there were professions that you would consider to be sort of almost in line with that sort of nobility rank, things like teaching and those involved in medicine or education. Only those Kanaks were considered politically astute enough to be allowed the right to vote. And sort of fast forward to the 1980s, and this is perhaps what's normally described as the height of the Kanak struggle for both independence and for indigenous sovereignty in the 1980s, and things that we're seeing now happen. So it sort of makes you think that history is like this carousel, right? It sort of just repeats itself, unfortunately. During the 80s, the protest movement was booming, and that actually came off the back of other nationalist movements that were happening all over the world. So, for example, my uncle and a number of indigenous Kanak people were flown to Libya, and during that time they stayed and were sort of welcomed by Gaddafi and the Libyan government at the time. They were sort of instructed on things like nation building and how to effectively organize within your people and to stop things like fissures or cracks or divisions happening within your own communities towards whatever goal that you see fit. For my understanding is that for Gaddafi, it wasn't about independence. It was about saying, well, look, you have your own end goal, and that's for you as Kanak people to decide whatever that means. But these are sort of the tools that we can sort of offer. And one of my first cousins, that's why his name is Hassan, because he was actually born in Libya. So
wow. Maybe this
there's
is another reason why the French hated Gaddafi so much.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look. Anyone meddling in their affairs are always public enemy number one for the independent, and they've got a long list of those people. They all seem to occupy the same level of, I guess, distaste. But Canucks were really influenced by this nationalism movement. They were influenced by Castro. They were influenced by Rastafarian culture. All of this really to say that for them, they felt that if there was going to be a point in history where they could finally take sort of the political reins and sort of bend the arc of the future towards Canuck sovereignty and towards independence, that was the time. But necessarily when you are protesting and when a large part of that protest means sort of disavowing the status quo, disavowing your colonizer, that's uncomfortable. And at that point, that's when indigenous Canucks go from being protesters to thugs. They're
Militants, eh?
hooligans, they're militants, they're setting up
Yeah.
militia, just like in other parts of the world where this was happening, during the Cold War, everywhere. Of course, the natural response is to send a large fleet of gendarmes and special tactical force, legal and law enforcement officers to quell the protest, to stop resistance, and to bring peace and stability to the island.
This is just all fascinating stuff that, Kanak people were inspired by Castro, other movements in Africa. In 1980, for example, Zimbabwe got independence through a people's war against the apartheid government there. So that's fascinating. And the 80s were quite a fraught period, right? I saw this report in New York Times from 1984, which says 10 militants die in clash on French Isle, when it was actually a massacre of Kanak activists. Can you talk about that history?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure which particular event you're talking about.
So
Only
there are
because,
many.
yeah, because there were many. Because there
Yeah.
were many, and I think that's also something that needs to be made quite clear to anyone listening who wasn't really versed in that 1980s history. I would, it's very reasonable to describe that period as for the island as being really on the brink of a civil war, when there were clashes between gendarme or police, because France have different sort of levels and different types of law enforcement. These clashes were often they were fraught, and it was really difficult for media then to report on it. One, because it's a tiny island in the middle of the South Pacific. Two, it's one of the few nations in the South Pacific where the main language is French. And three, as we've seen from the recent state of emergency that was declared by Macron and his government, communications between the outside world and those living in Kanaky was really difficult. So sometimes, and that's really the reason why reports are, sort of, for lack of a better word, inaccurate, because there really isn't a way to actually sort of legitimize what's coming out of the country, because generally the news that comes out of the country has to go first through sort of the traditional media
Right.
spin, etc. So
Yeah.
that's effectively what's happening at the time. Like my own family were very much involved in the protest movement. My dad was arrested several times, so were all of his siblings, and it was for my dad, seeing what's happening now it really elicits a visceral reaction to everything, because he just feels like there's a potential that we could go back into what we experienced in the 80s. Although I don't necessarily think that that'll be the case.
Yeah.
I think because of the ability for and because of social media and because of technology that exists now, I think it's much easier to sort of organize yourselves in a way that, there aren't people who are sort of jumping rank when when
Yeah.
maybe the solution is actually just sit down and have some kind of telenor or some corridor first before we decide what we do next.
And for me, something that was striking about that report from New York Times is, the passive voice. 10 militants die in a clash on a French Isle, when the same incident has been described by an activist as a massacre in which armed settlers, actually killed Kanak activists. So that the same kind of strategies of colonial media that we see in Palestine today, the baby died or, found dead in a tent or in a car, that same kind of language and strategies being used to justify the ongoing colonial violence in these places.
Yeah, and that's so true. I think when you're someone who particularly has a vested interest in the things that are happening in Kanaky, and you compare the experience to people who are experiencing very similar kinds of struggle, you really quickly identify the things that feel really wrong, and sometimes you can't quite put your finger on what it is, but things like language are massive. The images that are used, the particular parties who seem to have a say on the narrative. It's really easy to identify something is up, but what is missing is actually someone telling you why you may or may not be right, and the extent to which your thoughts and feelings are correct. I certainly have been seeing that in the way that reports are coming out of Kanaky. If I see another article about repatriation flights, I might just disconnect my Wi-Fi router. It's really difficult because I have family there, and my feelings are always directed towards their safety and how they're feeling, and so I think we tend to think that this feels like the 1980s, and the reason why the 1980s was so important is because that's really where we start all of this Accords process. In 1988, and sort of at the height of the violence, just before really the island would descend into a civil war, there's a particular event that happens. It's known as the Uvea hostage crisis. Uvea is one of the outer islands down in the south. Uvea also, like many parts of Kanaky, is endowed with iron ore or lots of iron ore deposits. And during the time, there were maybe between 20 and 30 Kanak freedom fighters who were stationed there on the island, and they effectively got into a clash with the local gendarme, and they took some of them hostage. Some of those gendarmes were killed, and in response, France sent over this large deployment of this sort of tactical fleet. They descended upon Uvea, and they made sort of very quick work of the Kanaks who were there in the caves there on the island. It was at this point, after France had well and truly used what can only be described as quite excessive force, they thought, oh, well, we probably need to broker some kind of peace agreement, because something is going to happen, and it probably will be much worse than what we're seeing now. And I think everyone, not just the government, not just the French Republic, but also the loyalists, also Kanak people as well, really felt that was sort of the next step. Then this is what starts the Accords process. They sign a peace treaty known as the Matignon Accord, and that effectively is sort of a unilateral agreement to say, okay, we stop everything. France will start removing gendarmes at a X rate, and we all agree that we need to have a discussion about what the future is of Kanaky.
Can you talk to me about, you talked about iron ore. There's other important mineral wealth in Kanaky, correct? Is it nickel?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. And
yeah.
can you also talk about, what is France extracting this, cheaply from Kanaky, just as it is doing, uranium extraction from Niger, where a majority of people don't have electricity, but it's basically sourcing 1/3 of France's electricity. So is it a similar pattern that's happening in Kanaky? And also, can you talk to me about the relationship between the settlers and Kanak people? Is it one of tension? Is there huge economic disparity? Are there, a double standard in terms of rights and access to resources, land, and so forth?
No, thank you. That's a great question. Mining in New Caledonia, in Kanaky, is partially nationalized, and that's done through a cooperative. It's effectively just an arm of the French Republic that owns interests in some of the open cast mines around the island. That tends to be the majority of the actual nickel that's being extracted off the island. But in terms of the size of some of and this leads to the second point, is that there are, because it's actually, as you can imagine, it's the transport costs associated with taking nickel from the South Pacific and transporting it to France is really costly. The French decided to open up access to nickel or to other multinationals. So you have so at one stage, one of the biggest mines in the country was run, owned, and operated by a Canadian parent company. And at different times, there's been a Brazilian cooperative that have had different stakes in nickel mining in the country. But what this means is, particularly for those overseas owned and operated mines, they tend to employ or bring over workers from other parts of the world. So instead of, I guess, one, and this is before you even consider that there are open cast mines that are in the vicinity of traditionally owned land, or on once traditionally owned land, or the effects of the mining affects the local flora and fauna of Kanak villages, and some of the subsistence farming and fishing that we do, that's both traditional and sort of more modern. And that's before we even start talking about what the agreements, if any, exist, or partnership exists between Kanak people, their land, and these overseas, particularly overseas companies that are running these mines, right? They'll employ people from places where they can find effectively where they can find relatively cheap labor. So parts of Southeast Asia, and sometimes parts of Eastern Europe. So we find that not only are they setting up shop and extracting a lot of our natural resources and effectively the wealth that's the corresponding wealth, we also find that we're having larger influxes of people from overseas onto our lands, and they have to live somewhere. They have to. And fair enough, if you're someone who's been flown from halfway around the world to somewhere else because you're wanting to find a better life for your family, that's just what happens. But it means that they have to have settlements in areas where they're sort of removing Kanak people from the entire picture. So even then, the sort of incidental economy that should happen for Kanak people and those living in the lands around these mines doesn't
exist.
Yeah, exactly. They're not.
Wow. Okay, so can you tell me about, in terms of the economic system, the industries, how do Kanak people, make their livelihood? Their land has been taken over, a lot of key land, which you talk about. is being used for mining and extraction of resources by multinational corporations. So can you talk about the livelihood of Kanak people?
Cool. Well, it may not come as a surprise to you that even though in the Accords process there was meant to be effectively a rebalancing of sort of the economic structure in Kanaky for the betterment of Kanak people. That's why the independent faction and Kanaks signed up to the Accord. There was very clear sort of guidance that when we devolve power to Kanaky, when we move in this sort of this quasi decolonization process, we're going to put Kanak people at the center of trying to bring up their own sort of lot in life. Unsurprisingly, despite these promises, none of that is eventuated. In every sort of traditional indicator of quality of life, Kanaks are experiencing the worst end of all of these: education, healthcare, sort of civil participation. Kanaks are infant mortality, all those sort of social and kind of objective indicators always place Kanak people in worse off. And that means that in terms of the overall economy, what's interesting about Kanaky is that it's actually a lot of the economy is what you sort of describe as artificial, because most of the economy is propped up by French sort of spending. Billions of dollars are spent by the French Republic, mainly for the purposes of benefiting people who have moved over from the French metropolitan area. There are, there have been programs that have been instituted to allow for French citizens from metropolitan France to come to New Caledonia and sort of be set up in these sort of municipal jobs, and a lot of them have been created since since the Accords process begun, and a lot of the positions in the municipality are generally taken by French people coming from French metropolitan.
Right. Okay.
So it means that because most of the country's economy rests upon the extraction of raw material, tourism, and sort of what happens within the governance level because of the funding from France, it's sort of like an artificial economy where unless you have a real stake in each of those industries, you're not actually doing anything that's sort of economically viable on a personal level, or economically viable for you and your sort of extended family and family unit as well. So if we do have jobs, they're generally the lowest paying jobs. There'll be Kanak people who are educated in France in the same universities as those who sort of immigrate over from the metropolitan area, and unsurprisingly, we don't seem to be getting jobs either. And unsurprisingly, despite programs aimed at increasing our involvement in civil life, trying to involve us in things like the law and medicine and governance, we still haven't seen a change in the number of Kanak people that work in any of those industries. Like for me, for example, I think I'm only like one of a handful, literally a handful of Kanak lawyers in the world. And if you think about that in the context of hundreds of years of colonization and an Accords process that was literally purposed to assist Kanak people, into these kinds of professions, and really just to assist Kanak people generally, nothing has really come of it. So the funding that comes from the French Republic is pumped into structures that really just benefit those who are French, and by French I mean particularly those from the metropolitan France area.
Why does this sound so familiar somehow?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so there were 3 referenda, correct? And in all these 3 referenda, the first one was in 2018, is it? and then there was one in I don't know 20, and then recently. And so when I looked at some of the graphics, the data, I could see that all the Kanak-dominated regions voted for independence, and the settlers voted for continuation of colonialism. So in terms of population demographics, are the settlers now a majority? And also the most recent one, they got, I think, 97% or something in favor of continued French colonialism. And this was achieved through recognizing an influx of settlers as voters within the referendum. And one of the key independence movement parties boycotting that process during COVID. Is that, yeah. And can you talk about the demographics?
No, that's again, another great question. So a best way to describe it is to try and go back a little bit, and that's to the Nouméa Accords, which are signed in 1998. Those accords, amongst a litany of things, where we have this, the sort of imposition of these three referendums. Before then, there was actually a referendum that was held in 1987, but that was heavily boycotted by Kanak people. And again, similarly, the vote to stay within the Republic was very high, something like 97, 98%. And the issue with the referendums is that when the Accords were initially signed in 1998, you start to see a large influx of people, of French citizens coming to Kanaky from the metropolitan area, and a large influx of French citizens who are from neighboring overseas territories. And it's not until around 2007 that, after a lot of campaigning and a lot of discussions between mainly the independent leaning parties and the French Republic, that they decided that they were going to put a freeze on this, what they call the special electoral roll, which affects sort of the governance elections. And they were going to put a freeze or put in some, well, the problem is that they changed the special electoral roll, but this roll that they used separately for referendums didn't really change much. So what they did change was a length of residency in order to be able to vote in the referendum. I think it was something like 10 years or something like that up until that point, and from that point on. So up until 2007, you've been in Kanaky for 10 years, and you're a French citizen, over 18, etc. You can vote in the referendum. Also acknowledging the fact that since 1998 till 2007, there's been a large influx of French migration. And then from 2007 onwards, again, you're allowed to vote in the referendum if you've been living on the island and resident for 10 years. And of course, the first referendum happens in 2018. So over that time, you're still experiencing a large influx of French expats to the island. And of course, they're mobilizing themselves with each wave of migration. One of the largest waves of migration, unsurprisingly, came during the global financial crisis, so 2008 to 2010. And then towards 2018, that's when it's all starting to ramp up. It's also a period where you start to see a really strong movement around the idea of a new Caledonian identity. So and again, back to the actual Accords in 1998, France, in their infinite wisdom, as part of the Accords, wrote in this idea that not only would they look to redress the harms that have befallen Kanak people, acknowledging Kanak people as the indigenous people of the land, and so on, they were also going to add in that the point of these Accords is also to find the best translation is a common destiny for people living on the island. And of course, this idea of a common destiny, it sort of takes many forms, but one of the more obvious ways that it does that is by creating this idea of a new Caledonian citizen or a New Caledonian person. And tied up into that is its own kind of identity. So you'll find the people who are loyalist and are either sort of first generation immigrants to from the French Republic to Kanaky. You'll find that if they've been there for the sort of 10 years or the requisite period for residency, they'll describe Kanaky as their land. They'll describe it as a place that they have sort of an inextricable link to. And you'll notice, and I notice it a lot when they report on, particularly, when they seek the views of people, sort of French settlers. That's the way they sort of couch their views on what's happening currently. They say it's, they haven't seen their island like that in such a long time. They're fearful of going back to what it was like in the 1980s. We don't want to have our island ruined. So, and the other complicating part of all of this is that the New Caledonian quote unquote identity also encompasses those from outer islands, like so from other overseas territories like Wallis and Futuna and Tahiti, and there's also quite a large demographic of Vietnamese. There's a large Vietnamese population. I think also a large Indonesian population as well. I'll just need to check that. But again, places where the French language was once spoken, and their migration sort of runs in parallel to the signing of the Accords in 1998, and of course following, I guess, the American War that happened in Vietnam. So that's this New Caledonian identity also encompasses them into this sort of discourse. Now that means that you have two competing factions. One that says we've been here since time immemorial, and this has been our land and will always be our land, and our practices and our family is here. A lot of Canucks refer to the to the land as red earth because that's the color of nickel. Nickel is red when you dig it up from the ground, and our lands are like that. So when we refer to the red earth, it's like it's the mixture of the blood of our ancestors and so on, but also it's created this resource, right? So it can be quite jarring when the context of a Canuck person comes up against this other sort of New Caledonian movement, this common destiny, if you will. And these seem to be the two competing ideals. And the way that it's framed from the loyalist faction now is that they want to remain in the Republic because it's the Republic that funds everything on the island. It's the Republic that has allowed us to create historically this New Caledonian identity, and it's the Republic that wants to create a common destiny for everyone on the island. We don't see why it wouldn't be unreasonable for everyone to just get along. And should in the future be one where we're all in this together, one common destiny, and we're all in it for the very same reasons, i.e., this is our land, right? This is our community. This is we're the ones who are now creating a future for everyone to take part in. So that's kind of that's sort of in a nutshell why we have this political tension.
Right.
It's because the problem with the French Republic is now they sort of happen to be this overseer that unilaterally makes changes or doesn't deliver on certain promises that were ensured in this accord process, and that's what affects the tension happening on this level between Canuck people who are on one end and New Caledonians and loyalists on the other. So that's why the tension happens, is because they are sparking the controversy by taking certain or making certain political moves, making certain statements about the future of Kanaky. And unsurprisingly, that's done without all the parties who are sort of meant to decide on the future, coming together and making this whole sort of declaration on where they all are. The problem is that people have all been sitting together in the same rooms over numerous years since the Matignon Accords and the Nouméa Accords, and nothing about their positions have changed. Kanak people have not changed their view that it's either independence or Kanak sovereignty, and that's really it. Or the loyalists and those who believe in this sort of common destiny saying, well, it's stay with France or lose everything that's so good about the island now. And I think that's France has always tried to kind of make itself out as this broker of peace. When this currently we're talking currently about this amendment to the Constitution that amends the special electorate role. The way the Republic sort of went about this whole process was they had sort of very little time to consult anyone on the island before they decided this was the right thing to do. They saw that the result of the latest referendum, which stepping back, which was boycotted by Kanak people because during the COVID pandemic, it was Kanak people who lost the most lives as a result of the pandemic. It was also sort of a point that really enunciated all of the issues that Kanak people were facing. Because they had poor access to healthcare in the places that they lived, it was harder for them to be vaccinated. Because Kanak people don't all speak the same language, we all have up to 30 different languages that are incomprehensible from each other. It's very difficult to mobilize communities to be vaccinated, to take the precautions that are needed. So of course it ended up in us experiencing a larger death toll.
But
and
also the
ahead.
factors you said before, like the disparity in terms of health, all these things do matter. Like, I think this was a pattern across the world. In the United States, the death rate of Native Americans was like so much higher, significantly higher than the general population, and similar patterns across the world. So connects back to your earlier point.
Yeah, exactly. And during that last referendum, Kanak people said, we don't want to have the referendum now, delay it, because a lot of us are still mourning our dead. And the mourning process in Kanak culture, differs for people all across the island. But generally speaking, it's an elongated one. It can take at the minimum for some Kanak communities, it take up to at least a year. People were still dying in 2020 and some still in 2021. So this was not the right moment to be campaigning on a political issue when most of the people who it's going to affect can't engage in the entire process. So that's why there was such a large boycott, and that's why 97% of the people who voted in favor of remaining with the Republic. France took this as a sign, despite being told to delay the referendum, and despite being told that there was going to be a mass boycott, and them pushing on, irrespective of what they've been told and the knowledge that they had. They said, well, look, that's an indication to us that perhaps the Accords process and all the promises therein have ended. And we now look to the future, and the future is this idea of a common destiny. And in order to ensure this idea of a common destiny, we are going to unilaterally change the special electoral roll that now allows up to 25,000 more people to vote in provincial elections, which end up deciding the makeup of the government in Kanaky. And of course, most of them are French settlers or those from other overseas French territories. So naturally, you can feel that as a kind of contingent, that this is a move to dilute as much as possible your political power. You've already found it difficult in the current governance structure, which only allows for what they know as what's known as a customary Senate. There is actually not too dissimilar from the Waitangi Tribunal. Where we're only allowed to make recommendations on certain bills before they're being proposed, and none of these recommendations are binding, and something can affect us wholeheartedly more than anyone else living on the island. But because they're only recommendations, they're not eventually legislated into law. Like, these are the things that we're already having to deal with, that were given to us in the Accords process, but were certainly not fit for purpose. And now we're having to deal with the separate issue, which feels like more and more we're being silenced. More and more, the issues that really matter to us feel like they can't be brought to the forefront anymore. And despite us being 40% of the population, there's at least 40% of the country, maybe even half, who have differing views on what it means to be living on the island. And for us, our livelihood is now at stake. Because if we have 25,000 more people voting in these provincial elections, and it's sort of like a proportionate voting system as you get higher up in sort of voting. Most of the concentration of Kanak people tend to be in maybe 2 or 3 different areas across Kanaky, one being the Loyalty Islands, one being the north in particular. If we're only getting votes coming in from there, it makes having a say in our governance really difficult, because even on a proportional basis, we still have far less people being voted in from the provinces that we tend to populate and where we tend to vote as well. So that's why young Kanak people are starting to protest. They're already sick of the idea that they find it incredibly difficult to find employment. And even if they have the necessary qualifications and attributes to apply for jobs with sort of similarly situated candidates, they're still not getting those jobs, even though there's a promise in the actual Accords process to allow for that, to allow for the consideration of Kanak people to happen.
So this whole idea of this new Caledonian identity, let us, have the same destiny for the settlers and the indigenous people, it's just duplicitous, and the double standards have shown in the recent referendum where, Kanak people boycotted it, but they still went ahead and steamrolled with it. I was seeing images of armed settlers terrorizing the protesters. We also saw about 5 deaths. I don't know if it's increased since I last looked at it, of which majority are, Kanak people. Do the settlers get to do this violence with impunity? Do they, get held to account? The earlier massacre that I read about from the 80s as well, it was armed settlers who killed 10 pro-sovereignty activists. So it seems like it's a pattern of a similar pattern we're seeing in Israel, where settlers are being armed as well to take law into their hands. What's going on? Is there a double standard in the law?
I probably couldn't comment on sort of the minutiae there, because I just don't know what kind of what's being afforded to these settlers. And I think the images that you're referring to are people who have decided to sort of create their own barricades around their property. And maybe this has sort of like overtones of what Marx has to say about law enforcement and the purpose of them really to just protect property rights. But I think there's certainly a theme here where a lot of these sort of French settlers are starting to sort of cordon off their own property, almost without, in some cases, almost without something having to spark it in the first place. So there might be reports of Kanak protesting and Kanak protesters setting up barricades in certain areas. But it might just be that a property owner, kilometers down down the road, or even in a more sort of distant area, deciding that they're going to set up a blockade and protect their property, because that's sort of the narrative that's occurring. We have what's happening here is there's a focus on looting, there's a focus on property damage. The island is burning. Businesses will not be able to recover. How do we get in? How do we receive imports, and how do we export during this time? All of that is made much more difficult because of these are their words, because of these young militia, because of these hooligans, because of these thugs that are terrorizing the island. So what you're seeing is their reaction to Kanak protest movement. The problem with a state of emergency is that it affords almost exclusive power to law enforcement. And there have been things like a restriction on social media, particularly TikTok. There's been a curfew that's been imposed, and again, these are techniques and strategies that are very familiar to people experiencing these kinds of events happening in their own countries all across the world.
And very familiar to anyone watching them as well at this point, as they become much clearer intentional responses, particularly to indigenous protest.
Yes, that's right. So yeah, they're setting up blockades. Whether they're involved in causing some of these deaths, I couldn't comment on that, because I just don't know. But you're right. The majority of people who have died, and I think it's the death toll is 7. The majority of them are Kanak, and the majority of them are young.
As of the 25th, I believe, 3 Kanak people had been killed by armed militia. So that is like not gendarme, not police. These are just people with guns. And one of the things that I've seen as being an issue is there's something like 100,000 guns circulating in the country as well, which I assume are ending up in the hands of a lot of these citizens.
Yeah, right. No, and look, very much like in the 1980s, those who were involved in the kind of protest movement weren't holding arms. I think you could reasonably describe what they were doing as sort of amateurish, and that's because they don't have the resources to begin with. If people are, if there is a circulation of armory across the island, I can almost guarantee you that most of that is not in the arms of Kanak people, most of what, or at least what I understand of what Kanak people are doing is really just being able to go out on the street, waving flags, sort of picketing, that sort of non-violent protest. That's what I've seen more recently, and of course, it's harder to know when you're not actually there. But at least from what I see, that's been shared in sort of the community. That's what's happening now. I think a lot more. It's hard for Kanak people because you never want to set fire to or risk damaging your own land. I think that's what people need to realize when Kanak people are setting up blockades or barricades, and what's been reported about what they're doing is occurring. It's not because they feel that they're laissez-faire about the land or the property around them. There is never ever in as long as I've been Kanak, or as long as I've known my own family and my own community, we've never wanted to tear down the beauty that is our own land. We are inextricably linked to it. If there are fires happening in our land and in our forests, that's not something that we want. So to get to the stage that we're at now really is a response to feeling like we're being prodded quite severely. I just need to make that clear.
Yeah, I just want to ask one last question from my side is, so Kanaky was occupied in 1853, you mentioned, as a penal colony by France. New Zealand as a colony was set up around that same time. What has been the history of New Zealand's relationship with, the colonial administration and the people of Kanaky? Are you happy with the current response of the New Zealand government? What should we do here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, to support the Kanaky cause?
No, that's a great question. I think it's difficult because I think generally, and this is my own personal opinion, I think the matters of the Pacific perhaps aren't really given the same kind of gravitas as events that happen, particularly in the West.
I'm going to call that an objective fact. I don't think it's an opinion.
Yeah.
And I just know that it's very hard to get any political capital behind the issues that affect the Pacific.
Right.
Our brothers and sisters in Papua New Guinea have just experienced a terrible natural disaster, and I can only imagine that it's terrible to have to look for your own family members through all of the debris. That would be harrowing. But in instances like that, it's almost as if the Papua New Guinean people are the fact that it's in Papua New Guinea is really all that's reported. It's like, okay, it happened in Papua New Guinea. These are the people that were affected. Next news story, right? And then it's out of the cycle almost overnight.
Yeah, people just shrug about it, right? Like, oh yeah, it's the islands. Bad stuff happens there. That's expected.
Yeah. And so it's hard because I don't know if there really is much political capital behind sort of trying to affect some kind of change or I think Winston Peters was sort of more and the government were sort of more concerned with these repatriation flights, which is fair. I mean, look, you don't want people who aren't from Kanaky stuck out there, and that's fair. But I think that's sort of the extent to on his comments. I think he said something along the lines of, I'm just paraphrasing, he wants to see an end to the unrest and the violence. But yeah, I think honestly that's probably going to be the extent. I don't envisage anything more serious than that in terms of the response from the government. It's difficult because we're so Kanaky is so close. Right? We're like a 2-hour flight away from New Zealand, and closer than some cities in Australia. And we are, I think Canucks have always hoped for a really close relationship with Aotearoa. I know that for Canuck people, they're always emboldened by Māori. I know that for a lot of us, to see the way that Māori have systemically and through lots and lots of their own protest, their own mobilization of their people, they've been able to create sort of like almost like an exception in some ways. And this is not to say that the effects of colonization are not very rampant and real for Māori people. I think a lot of Māori will agree that they aren't. But we as Indigenous people from Kanaky definitely look to Māori people for inspiration. And I know that for a lot of Kanak people, when they visit Aotearoa, the first thing they want to do is go to a marae. And that's because we understand how important it is to be in cultural spaces that are your own, because that is when you really meet and understand people best, particularly for Indigenous people, I'd say.
Yeah, and understand the land as well, I think.
Yeah. And on the marae, you're not going to get you'll get an unadulterated version of Aotearoa's history, and I think that's exactly what Kanak people want to hear and see. Of course, I wish that there would be a real sense of urgency from the government to, not to meddle, but at least to put your hand up and say, look, we acknowledge what's happening in Kanaky is really vexed. It emanates from historical grievances. If there is a way to for Aotearoa to broker something, we're willing to offer that assistance. That would be great. That would be great. I think that would be the height of anything possible. But I very much doubt that'll be the case.
I just want to say the University of Canterbury had a student protest and an encampment last week, and a number of speakers mentioned Kanaky to huge cheers from the protesters. So definitely there is solidarity here in Aotearoa, maybe not from, the government, but from the people, definitely. And I just want to say, we are living through this flashpoint in history where anti-imperialist movements are becoming so prominent. So let's hope that this will be, produce some results, hopefully a death knell for imperialism.
Fingers crossed. I think that's one of the things that we really need to keep an eye on as well, right? Like there is a lot of indigenous solidarity and independence movements across the world, which is fantastic. Like people are really, and it's not just the indigenous people, but people who support and showing solidarity with them, who are beginning to understand the way that these systems and structures work. But alongside that, there's also colonial and imperial solidarity. And that's why, earlier when you were talking about some of the ways that this presents itself, Joe, I was like, that sounds very familiar, because anyone who's lived in a colony has seen this play out and has seen these same policies, the same branding applied to attack indigenous self-determination. They're all using the same playbook and they're all backing each other up. We just hope that they all get dragged down together at the same time as they grasp at power. We are getting on in the episode, but Joe, you mentioned what you'd hope to see from Aotearoa, or from the New Zealand government, I should say. But what do you think is likely to happen, if that's not putting you on the spot too much, with the current crisis in Kanaky? And how do you hope to see that resolve, given Macron has flown out but left 3,000 gendarmes in the region?
Yeah, look, it is difficult. It's hard to get a real. It's hard to perform a litmus test on sort of the mood now going forward from all of this. What I will say is, with an increased presence of law enforcement, that only really sort of leads to one thing, and that's just greater sort of tension. It doesn't solve the issues that you had sent the gendarme to sort of alleviate. Because sure, you can arrest hundreds of people, you can put them on house arrest, you can do clean sweeps of Numea. You can do all of those things, but it will never remove the fact that the tensions and the things that have been boiling for so long, and the way that Kanak people feel now, that will never change. It wasn't any different before the 1980s. It wasn't any different after the peace treaty. It wasn't any different after the Accords process began. And again, using this sort of tried and true playbook, expecting to have a different result, I think is futile. And I know that for Kanak people, they feel, whilst they're cautious and they're fearful, it does feel like a bit of an ascendancy. The fact that it's eliciting a response from the Republic, it probably might be useful that there are other movements where lots of people around the world are gathering together in solidarity. And that's also important because that's what was also happening at the time of the 1980s. And I think in addition to all of that, France now almost have to fight a war on several fronts because former colonies are saying no. They're wanting to remove associations to France. They're wanting to remove even the use of French language, that for many of those countries, similar to Kanaky, was actually a language to allow for communication between different communities within those nations. But even they're seeing the benefit in creating a course or a path to the future that's completely, under their own direction. And I think now with the Olympics happening, and there's a whole bunch of things that French people themselves have to say about Macron, his government, and the way they're going to run these Olympics. And what the French people will do to their own government, that's a separate issue. And if you're Kanak right now, and you're acknowledging that someone has, your former colonial, or rather your colonial incumbent who's all the way on the other side of the world worrying about all of these security issues, that's almost like the perfect time for you to mobilize. It's the perfect time for you to really push for that political ascendancy. And now is sort of the right time to say, hey, look, there are other places in the world where they're doing this. France don't have their eye on the ball. This might be the most opportune moment since the 1980s to actually do something different and to actually do something that's good for us. Even with all of this electoral reform. I mean, I think the electoral reform is all, they just have to rubber stamp it, really. It's in now. But that's not going to change the views of Kanak people. And I think where we are at now, we've got an opportunity that we haven't had in 20-something years. That's all I got to say about that.
Got it, Joe. Thank you for joining us.
No, thanks so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure. It's always really nice to be amongst friends. It's always really encouraging to know that the thoughts and feelings that you have about things happening in your own country are felt by and really appreciated by people, particularly here in Aotearoa. Like I've lived here most of my life, and it's been so encouraging to have people reach out to me and ask how things are for my family and I, ask about things that are happening in Kanaky and where does it all stem from, and that means a lot. So platforms like this are really important. I wish you both the best in continuing the podcast. I think you got a new subscriber, and I can't wait for all the content you guys will release in the future. So thank you so much.
You've done my pitch for me.
I just want to conclude by congratulating the Kanak people for, bringing down the mask of liberty, equality of the republic that doesn't allow other countries to be republics. There you go.
That's always the best irony of them all. All of those values in the Marseillaise until it applies to someone else. Yeah.
Thank you for joining us as a co-host this evening as well, Josephine. It's been great to have you along.
Thank you so much. Ka kite ano.
Joe, if people want to find your work online, is there anywhere they can do that?
Well, I'm not really writing anything at the moment. I've written a sort of short explanatory article through the spin-off. So yeah, just look up my name in the spin-off, and I've written a little piece there about what's happening back home. Otherwise, yeah, I work at a place.
Don't dox yourself.
No.
We can link the article at the
We'll link the article in the summary. I just want to give a shout out to Mick Hall in Context. That's mickhall.substack.com. One of the few people I've seen who's been reporting on this objectively, and the reason why I am up to date, at least to an extent, on a series of issues. So go check out that Substack as well. If you've enjoyed this, listen to Joe, subscribe, share, let people know that there is independent content out there, and we'll be back again on the weekend with our current events episode. That's been another chapter of 1 of 200. We'll catch you next time.
Thank you.
If
Thanks.
artifices are then I'm living a pointless life, but learning all your lessons. Fucking politics, there's no distinction. The road's upon now is paved with good intentions. And I'll admit that I'm at a loss for what to say when they criticism cost me ought to stay. Cause I live amongst the people every day in this vindictive, forgetful fucking race.